Hello and welcome to week 24 of history. Got 3 lessons for you today as we head into the home stretch on this 2022-2023 academic year. We're going to start off by looking at the formation of another subgroup, a sect, if you will, within the Protestant movement. Now, we've talked about the broader Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther and all that good stuff, and the persecution of Protestants, but over the course of the centuries in Europe, they're beginning to find strong footholds, and so strong, in fact, that there are subgroups within the Protestants that are starting to break away, thinking that the regular Protestants had gotten kind of old, stale, and unchurchy, if you will. We see the Puritan push in England, but even among the Puritans, there's a group that wanted to take religion and living out God's call to the next level. We're going to talk about the formation of the group called the Quakers. Their founder, usually if you want to talk about the founder of a religious movement, sometimes the origins are murky. Not murky here. George Fox was the founder of the Quakers movement. They got their name sort of as a derogatory. Evidently, Fox was defending himself to a judge one time, and he told the judge that he ought to, quote, tremble at the word of the Lord. And the judge accused Fox of being a trembler or a Quaker. They caught on, and they became known as the Quakers. They called themselves the Society of Friends, officially, and that's what they prefer. I think they've come to adopt Quakers, even though it was originally meant to be a derogatory term, but they've sort of incorporated it. And when you talk about Quakers, even today, you know what they're talking about. Was Fox in Puritan England. And, of course, his life spanned some of the years under the rule of Oliver Cromwell. The Puritans, of course, were very happy to have Cromwell as not the king, but the Lord Protectorate of the United Kingdom. And they, again, as we talked about last week, they tried to fuse their Puritan beliefs with government and became the oppressors, decades after they were the oppressed. George Fox represented a group of people within the Puritan movement. Of course, we're still talking Anglican Church here in England, who were concerned about the growing number of Protestants who practiced the outward appearance of their faith, but did not demonstrate any inward transformation. Fox called them hypocrites. After an ancient Greek word meaning sort of like pretending. But he called them professors, as in those who professed the faith but did not live the faith. And he saw that attitude was very widespread, in his opinion, in the Anglican Church. When he was about 19, again, very young man, he began to travel England trying to find what he called a more sincere Christian experience. He found very few around him that had the same kind of what he would call genuine faith as he did. In 1647, at the age of 23, Fox said the Lord spoke to him and said, "There is one, even Jesus Christ, who can speak to thy condition." From that time on, Fox said he grew to understand what his purpose was. He wanted to use his faith and the faith of others to bring glory to God, and thus began his public ministry. He started that in the year 1648. He preached to outdoor crowds after the Puritan church services were over. He encouraged others to follow what he called the inner light of the Holy Spirit. He told his followers to be honest in their business dealings and compassionate to the needy. He taught simplicity in all things, in dress, at meals, and especially in worship. He was very, very concerned about the pomp of the Anglican Church, and again, Anglican incorporated a lot of the trappings of Catholicism. So you had, ornate cathedrals and big hats and robes and stuff like that. Fox was not about that. He said you should live simple lives and you should worship simply. He also believed that formal training was not a necessity for a preacher. The only necessity is to experience in knowing and loving God. They did not meet at churches. They met at meeting houses. The rich and the poor sat side by side. Men and women shared equally in expressing their faith. They practiced silence at times, too, the discipline of silence, waiting for God to speak to them. Of course, at the time, a lot of Europe was in the middle of a series of, at the time, England was in a series of civil wars that had an awful lot to do with organized religion. Fox taught against war, church rituals, and really formalities of any sort. He saw that as vanity, no matter if it was well-intentioned or not. One of the odd things about the Quakers is they did not believe in the polite practice at the time of tipping your cap to someone in a show of respect. They forbade that. They thought it was immodest. They thought it was giving glory to someone other than God, to whom it should go. And in a war-torn society, the Quakers' message of simplicity and basic faith really caught on. By the year 1660, there were 50,000 members of the Friends Society. George Fox remained humble throughout all this. He credited all to the Lord. But of course, again, the Puritans had clearly demonstrated they had no qualms about oppressing the Catholics in Ireland. Remember that? They thought the Quakers were a little bit too far out there, that they were being led by emotion rather than with no doctrine, really. Again, the Quakers did not believe in writing down things, professing faith to words. The only word was the Bible. And they rejected all that. Many took great offense to the fact that the Quakers wouldn't tip their caps. They considered it a form of disrespect. Fox was thrown into prison several times for very specious charges. All times he would be very gracious to his jailers while he was in jail, and when they finally let him out, he'd say, "Thank you for the stay." Again, the irony, the Puritans, those who had been greatly persecuted under England's first kings, two kings of the 17th century, were now the persecutors. Happens way too often. In 1677, George Fox made his first trip to the New World and brought along a companion named William Penn, and they spread the Quaker message in the New World. And of course, Penn, as we'll talk about later, founded the Quaker state of Pennsylvania. Fox returned to England, was thrown in prison again, was let out again. A few years before he died, the Quakers were finally recognized in England as a valid denomination under what was called the Act of Toleration. But when Fox died in 1691, the Quakers' numbers were over 100,000 in England, Scotland, and in North America. Again, Quakers are still around. They're a smaller denomination, but they've held fast to their beliefs. They are 100% nonviolent, non-war, and they still meet in meeting houses rather than churches. And they still practice a very, very pure form of the faith. We're going to move to France right now and talk a little math and science, but a little bit of religion too, and one of the more fascinating characters of his era. We're talking about Blaise Pascal. He died in the year 1654. He was born in France. As with most great mathematician minds, it showed at a very, very young age. At only the age of 16, he wrote an essay on the geometry of cones, and again, I'm not a mathematician. I couldn't tell you exactly what it was about, but it was good enough for the real mathematicians to look at it and go, the boy's a genius. He came up, one of his ideas still bears his name, called Pascal's theorem. It basically states this: in a hexagon, and part of a conic section. If you were to extend the lines of opposite sides until they intersect, the 3 points where the opposing lines intersect would form a straight line with them connected. Again, a little bit beyond my pay grade, but this is still a geometric law that guides geometry even today. He was, at the age of 19, his father was a merchant and took a job as a tax collector. That caused Pascal to invent a very simple form of the calculator. He called it the Pascaline, and there are still 50 of Pascal's original calculators floating around. Several of them are in a German museum. His biggest contribution directly was Pascal's law. Liquids in a confined vessel carry pressure in all directions at the same rate. Okay, what can we do with that? Well, it revolutionized the formation and improvement of pumps, of compressors, elevators. All work on the principle of equal pressure. The unit of measurement is also called the Pascal, even today. You can see where this application would be used in a lot of different fields. Again, this and really, it was one of the precursors to the model behind the internal combustion engine. Pascal was doing this stuff in the 17th century, long before that. Now, Pascal had a little bit of a wild side about him, too. He liked to gamble, he liked to hang with gamblers, and he worked with them, oddly enough, again, combining this interest with his passion for mathematics and science. He worked and developed what he called the probable outcome of card games, and basically looked at card game situations and calculated the odds that a certain move would or would not work. His theory of probabilities is still used today. It is the basis for probability statistical analysis, and we see it all the time, and even more so today in our society. A few years later, Pascal had a brush with death from a horse-drawn carriage, and he had been a professed Christian all his life, but he kind of said by his own admission he was only going through the motions. He actually withdrew from society and moved in with his sister, who was at a convent called Port Royal, made up of Janesists. They were basically a group of Roman Catholics who believed, like the Calvinists did, in predestination. He adopted himself to his new surroundings. Of course, his intellect was obvious to everyone there, and they convinced Pascal to say, why don't you write a defense of our beliefs in grace and predestination? And so he did it. He did it in something called the Provincial Letters, 18 of them in all. Basically, he wanted to challenge a lot of the Roman Catholics, particularly the Jesuits, to encourage a more personal expression of faith. Oddly enough, Pascal used the same idea of probabilities that he explored with card games to defend having a faith in God. And if you look at it from this logical standpoint, it's a compelling argument. It kind of goes something like, if I wager that there is a God and I'm right, then I gain eternity for having believed in him. If I wager there's a God and I'm wrong, then I lose nothing for having believed in him. If I wager that there's no God and I'm right, then I lose nothing for having not believed in him. But if I wager that there's no God and I'm wrong, then I lose eternity for having not believed in him. From a logical standpoint, you can't really argue with that. Pascal died again in the year 1654. He was only 39 years old. He had suffered from stomach problems evidently all of his life, and he probably died of stomach cancer. But Pascal was great at mathematics, and when he set his mind to God, he was pretty good at being a Christian too. We're going to close out this week by talking about a monarch who is sort of the cartoon image of a king, with all the royal trappings that you could imagine. We're talking about Louis XIV, the Sun King, S-U-N. Sort of a derisive name because it was given to him by those who thought Louis believed the sun revolved around him. He was very much an absolute monarch. He believed in the divine right of kings, And as we saw last week, the English didn't care much for that attitude. They beheaded one of their kings that was like that. But in France, Louis XIV had one of the longest reigns in European history. And it was mostly peaceful in terms of the people. And you have to wonder, because France certainly later demonstrated a whole lot of revolutionary tendencies. They've had 5 political revolutions in the last 300 years. They might have been just plain fatigue, to be honest. He actually, when he was only 5 years old, Louis's father died. His father was the King of France. Louis inherited the title, but of course he was only 5. His mother became the real ruler of France, Anne of Austria. They ruled sort of with an iron fist, but their biggest thing is there was so much infighting in under this Queen Anne, unnamed Queen Anne. And during some revolts, she and her son were forced into hiding. When they returned, Louis was neglected in the federal court, in the Queen's court. Nobody really paid much attention to him. When he turned 13, he remembered all the hard times he had had and ended his mother's regency. And when he was 14, he returned to Paris, and the crowds gathered around him chanting, "Vive le roi," meaning "Long live the king." With great dignity, Louis, we'll call him that, strode into town, and he stayed there for about 70 years. When the chief minister died in 1661, Louis did not replace him with anyone. He wanted everybody to answer directly to him. He did not want to have to deal with middlemen and what have you. Again, France probably suffering from some war fatigue at this point. They'd had 30 years of the 30 Years' War, and 2 failed revolts. The French just seemed to sort of accept him, even though he was an absolute monarch. He ruled, again, with the divine right of kings in his mind's eye. He started a lot of border wars. He wanted to expand France's borders. That put a dent in their budget. He loved the pomp of being king. If it was gaudy, if it was royal, if it was regal, he was going to utilize it. In that vein, he began a project to build what would later be called the Palace of Versailles. He intentionally, because of the way he was treated as a kid by Parisians, moved the government, the monarchy, out of Paris. Versailles is 9 miles outside of Paris. It took 47 years and 30,000 laborers to complete the project at Versailles. It is opulence times infinity. It has walls of solid marble, 1,400 fountains around the grounds. The front of the palace is a 1/4 mile wide. It was lit at night in Louis' times by thousands of candles. One room, the Hall of Mirrors, contains 357 large mirrors and 17 arcades. The Salon of Apollo has a solid silver throne. It was as ornate as you could possibly imagine. As a result, Louis didn't need to leave. He had room there to house about 10,000 people who lived on the palace grounds. He had one attendant to put his coat on, the other to hand him his wig, another to hand him his napkin. Again, this guy is royal opulence. He created probably the first modern fashion industry. He encouraged the creation of a fashion magazine in Paris in 1672. His coats were trimmed with real gold, studded with actual diamonds. He loved the pomp and ceremony of being King Louis. He didn't like the work of being a king, though, and as a result, he was not a good king in that respect. It was said that Versailles was so large, by the time the king got his food from the kitchen, it was usually cold. Another odd thing about the palace at Versailles, very few bathrooms. For 10,000 people, there's only a handful of bathrooms in the whole building. Of course, the more time Louis spent inside of his royal palace, the less time he spent with ordinary people. He grew very indifferent to the needs of the common man, and the poor, obviously, grew to resent the king and his opulence. He had so much fun playing king, the author of the book says, that he failed to be a very good one. He set up what was called a royal bureaucracy, which handled all the affairs of state while he played king. His one area where he was unfortunately very active in was in oppressing Protestants, the Huguenots in France. Again, Louis was a Roman Catholic, and he revoked the Edict of Nantes, which the document that given the Huguenots freedom to worship. You'll remember in the 16th century, there were some terrible, terrible confrontations in France, massacres of Huguenots. And so here we go. The people of France thought we had put this Protestant versus Catholic stuff behind us. We'd learned to live, and now here we go again. More oppression. Basically, he took their freedom to worship away. France was, in terms of relations there, taken back 100 years. All Huguenot churches were destroyed. No public or private worship by Huguenots were allowed. Huguenot children had to be baptized by Catholic priests and raised in the Roman Catholic Church. Huguenot ministers who did not convert to Catholicism had to leave the country in 10 days or be put to death. About 500,000 Protestants left France for Germany, the Netherlands, and other places. Louis XIV ruled for over 70 years, I believe, 72 years, and it was one of the longest in European history, but all in all, he was not a good king, because he was more interested in playing king than being king. And again, he was yet another religious oppressor. We'll talk more about it on Monday. See you then.